So I want to thank, before I get started, Nancy and Tara with the library for helping organize everything and get us all set up on Zoom, and Bob Dodd, who has organized this series for quite a long time and invited me to give the talk. So as Nancy said, I'll talk for a little while, and then I'm happy to talk through questions and have a conversation. So let me make sure I can share my screen properly. This is the key moment. There we go. Okay. I want to begin with a story set on Christmas Eve, 1773. A man rides down the street in Philadelphia and dismounts in front of the printing office of William Bradford. He has news from Boston. Bradford takes a set of papers from the man, a Boston-based express rider and silversmith named Paul Revere. Back in his shop, Bradford and his apprentices work quickly to set the type for a single page of newspaper text. As a header, Bradford titles the sheet, "A Christmas Box for Customers of the Pennsylvania Journal," his weekly newspaper. Now, tension had filled the air in Philadelphia for weeks as twin dramas played out. The first was the local wait for a ship destined for its wharves loaded with East India Company tea to be sold by monopoly to colonists. The Sons of Liberty, the city's anti-imperial newspaper printers, and political leaders had worked for weeks to ensure that residents would treat the tea as a tyrannical expression of authority. At the same time, reports began to flow from the eastward, and Philadelphians read eagerly as they heard that 3 tea ships had landed at Boston, that the customs officer had refused to clear the rest of the ship's goods without also clearing the tea, that the governor wouldn't let the ships leave, and that Sons of Liberty would not allow the tea to land. Now the climactic news was here. Boston's patriots, their faces disguised with soot, had dumped 340 chests of East India Company tea into Boston Harbor. The Christmas box would announce the news to Philadelphians. The resulting document, which you hopefully can see here, the original is at the Boston Public Library, shows the confluence of media and communications networks that my book, Revolutionary Networks, describes. The broadside includes information from print, manuscript, handwritten, and oral sources. So first, it excerpts the Massachusetts Spy, a Boston newspaper published by Isaiah Thomas on the morning of December 16th, just before the tea was dumped. The excerpt includes updates about town meetings, the work of the ship's owner, Francis Roach, to negotiate something between the Sons of Liberty in Boston and Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who was in hiding at his mansion in nearby Milton. Several resolutions by the town of Lexington to forswear the drinking of tea, and a few other items. At the end of the second column, in that green box, Bradford reprinted a letter forwarded from the New York Committee of Correspondence, in which the Boston Committee celebrated the destruction of the tea. So we've got reprinting from a print source, a newspaper, we've got reprinting from a handwritten source, a letter. Finally, there's a section in the middle, and I've highlighted it in yellow, that describes the actual dumping of the tea on the evening of the 16th. This description appears nowhere else in print. I have not been able to find it, and I assure you I have looked. By the time Boston's newspapers next published their regular issues on Monday, December 20th, the account was a little bit different. My guess then is that this is either from a letter, or I suspect it's the report delivered by none other than Paul Revere when he actually arrived in Philadelphia. So this single sheet, therefore, embodies a set of networks that were crucial for the revolution. The document became possible because of the work of committees, with which lots of people are familiar, and Paul Revere, obviously, but it also existed because of the networks that printers created as part of their everyday work in their trade. So my interest in this topic started by noticing that there was something missing, something unusual in how most scholars talked about publications from the Revolution. People have studied and argued about the arguments that Thomas Paine and John Dickinson and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and even people not named Thomas or John, have made either in support of or against imperial policies. And the scholars who write about this topic often emphasize the importance of these arguments appearing in print, in newspapers, in pamphlets, or in other forms, and sometimes note the crucial role of circulation. But for most historians, that's where they stop. All they say is, Print is important. These were in print. Print circulated, therefore lots of people read them. And they don't ever actually really explore the meaning of that process. So my goal is to peel back the layers of that process to see how the news gets made during the American Revolution. And it turns out that something really important and interesting happens during the process of getting material printed, distributed, and circulated. Work that took place inside and between printing offices. On the surface, these texts, even the miscellaneous collected paragraphs of the colonial newspaper, such as this special edition if you didn't have the colored highlighting, appear to offer a relatively coherent argument. But that smoothness and that clarity obscure the work that was going on behind the scenes. Printers who created these newspapers, I argue, exerted significant influence on the texts, arguments, and news about the revolution, and they did so in ways that reflected their own political and business perspectives, as well as the business networks and practices in which they engaged. In other words, when we consider the business decisions of printers and think about the material composition and circulation of text, actually watch them move through space, we can learn a great deal about how and which political arguments became salient and popular between the 1760s and 1780s. To take a step back, though, let's start with a more basic question. Who were colonial printers and what did they do? So I found in my research, created a database of 756 printers who were active sometime between the 1750s and the 1790s in the British North American colonies and then in the United States. And that let me trace careers, linkages among printers, and to be able to make some general statements about them as a group. So, some general statements. On the socioeconomic spectrum, they fell somewhere in the mushy middle as a group. From the super successful Benjamin Franklin to those whose careers, if we can even use that word, were so brief that I had trouble finding more than a single mention of them. And the printing trade put printers at a hinge point of society. They were tradesmen, they were manual laborers, they were artisans who performed physically demanding work. And you could tell that on their bodies, you could tell that on their hands that were often described as ink stained. But at the same time, they interacted and mingled with the elite of society. They usually had to be literate, and by the Revolution, this was broadly true for printers. And they often wrote some material themselves for their publications, especially their newspapers. They also had a broader geographic view than most American colonists. Many, in fact, needed to travel to a new town, often hundreds of miles away from where they grew up, when they reached adulthood in order to become a master printer. The nature of the business and the size of colonial towns meant that most towns other than New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, they could only support one printer. So once you were done with your apprenticeship, unless you became the partner of the master printer you had worked with, which sometimes did happen, sometimes it happened because an apprentice married the master's daughter. If that wasn't true, though, you had to move. And that's fine because they needed to make contacts across the colonies and across the broader Atlantic world in order to maintain sufficient material for their newspapers and success in other areas of their business. They need to be circulating information. Sometimes these work through networks or connections through kinship or common work history. The most notable, were the Green family in New England, which numbered several dozen cousins in New England, all the way down to Annapolis, Maryland, by this era, and the connections that Benjamin Franklin developed throughout the Atlantic world. The average printer produced a broad range of materials. They're doing a wide range of work. Number one, they're doing job printing. This is essentially what we would say today if you walked into Staples or I still want to say Kinko's and asked for something to be printed, printing to order. They printed almanacs, they printed pamphlets, they printed newspapers, they printed broadsides, which are essentially one-page posters, and a wide range of other materials, pre-printed forms for commerce, for legal documents, things like that. They printed very few books. Those were a really big investment, and the printing offices were very small. And it was cheaper to just import the books from London or Dublin or some other European location. They often ran side businesses, usually related to printing, so they sometimes sold books as well, or sold stationery. They competed for government contracts to print laws, legislative journals, and so on. Those contracts were lucrative and sustaining. They were a consistent payment. And they often sought government positions, especially in the post office, in seeking to make these kinds of information connections, to have access to even more information networks. And it's important to note that the printing office is a family business. The apprentices were considered part of the family. In most cases, the master printer was a man. In some cases, there were women who ran printing offices. But in all of the other cases, assuming the master printer was married, his wife was running the household. She was feeding the apprentices and the staff. She was clothing the apprentices. That was part of the contract. She often worked keeping account books or worked in the shop, first floor shop itself, selling the stationery or books or things like that. All of this labor, though, printing was a very difficult trade in which to succeed economically. And Franklin, who's well known for this, is the exception that proves the rule. He's the only one who becomes fabulously wealthy from printing. Because most of them had trouble keeping themselves in operation, they tended before the Revolution to try and avoid appearing too partisan in their publications, lest they lose any significant business. It's great if you're the only printer in town, but if you anger half the town, that means you don't have enough business to keep going. So they adopted a free press strategy that Franklin himself had outlined in 1731 in his newspaper, and it's what's known now as the Apology for Printers. Essentially, what Franklin recommended was that printers adopt what he called a free and open press. And by that, he meant, in terms of freedom, one free from government interference, so no licensing of printing, no beforehand censorship, and no censorship afterwards. And open to all parties. We will print anyone. There was an ideological component to that, to be sure, but it's as much a business strategy as anything else. As with all things Franklin, the appearance of freedom and openness was critical to avoiding controversy. He actually used it to wade into controversy and make his opinion felt in a variety of ways. So politics, as we'll see as we move along, could and did appear in any of the print media that printers produced, but I focus a lot of my energy on newspapers because that's where we can watch things circulate and see the hand of printers most clearly. Newspapers were important for printing offices, not because they were lucrative, they were not, but because they put a printer's work into the community on a regular basis, and because they provided some steady revenue through advertising and a little bit through subscriptions. People were bad about paying their subscriptions. When we look at a colonial newspaper, we can see at first why for a long time historians of politics and journalism discounted the role of printers. And so here I have the Pennsylvania Journal from May 26, 1763. This is page 1 and 4. So they're usually 4 pages printed each week, and they're one sheet of paper folded once. So this is unfolded, but you can see page 1 and 4 as they would have been printed. So most of the newspaper is often just advertisements. You can actually see in this particular issue, page 1 and page 4 are all filled with advertisements, public notices, things like that, that the printer included. There's very little, therefore, original content in the newspaper, and I'll skip ahead to pages 2 and 3. You can maybe see in the upper left corner of page 2, there's a sign that says "To the Printer." And then about halfway down the first column of page 3, you may or may not be able to read it, but it says Philadelphia in all caps. That's the local news, is that one little paragraph that follows. And that's it for the news. Everything else that follows that on page 3 is more advertisements. And this is very typical for newspapers. There's very little original content. So for a long time, people said, well, there's nothing in these. But that obscures the work that printers are doing. Just to give you a sense, the audience for these newspapers is very small. The example I always use is Boston in the 1760s was about 15,000 people. But the audience for newspapers was mostly men of a certain social status. So if you eliminate all children, you're down to 7,000 to 8,000, about half the population are children. If you assume that the women aren't the primary audience, that gets you down to about 3,500. And then you can assume that a fair number of the 3,500 adult men are laborers. They can't afford a newspaper. They're not engaged in the political and commercial debates of the day. We're talking about 1,500 men as the audience in Boston. They talk to each other about what's going on in Boston. What they want to read is what's coming from elsewhere. So the newspaper printers are making very careful choices from week to week about what to include from other places. And in this particular paper, I'm not going to go through it very detailed, but there's news from Savannah, Georgia, from Charleston, from Boston, from Newport, Rhode Island. There's almost always news from London, although I'm not seeing it in this one, but most issues of most newspapers include some London news. They get their news from 3 places, and these are the 3 that we talked about at the beginning. Oral reports. Literally, people walk into the printing office and say, hey, did you hear about this thing? And then that appears in the newspaper with a paragraph that usually starts, we hear that such and such is happening. That happens with people getting off of ships, and especially if you're in busy ports like Boston or New York or Philadelphia or Charleston, where someone gets off a ship and says, I just got off the ship from London. Here's what was going on 7 weeks ago. Here's the latest from Parliament. Handwritten news. They would reprint letters. This is one of the reasons why they want to be postmasters, when they want to be part of the post office. If they're involved with the post office, people have to come to them to pick up their mail. They open the letter, they read it, they may see something interesting from a correspondent in another city in the colonies, or from London or Bristol or Dublin or wherever. Belfast was a popular destination. And last, they circulate copies of their own newspapers to other newspaper printers to pull paragraphs for their own newspapers. So the job of the printer each week is not to produce content, but is to edit, to curate news from these variety of sources to put into the newspaper. And it's a lot of work. I want to show you just a small example and show you how the hand of the printer can make, in a very small way, a very big difference. So here's 2 versions of the same paragraph. On the left is from the New Jersey Journal, and published in Chatham, New Jersey. That was near Elizabeth, New Jersey, if any of you ever go down to North Jersey. And it's where the Continental Army was encamped for a long time during the war. So it reporting on a naval engagement near St. Croix in the Caribbean, in which the British Admiral Rodney lost a leg, and the French win a resounding victory. And that's what's reported in the New Jersey Journal. Now you can see there's a line along the side of it. That copy of the New Jersey Journal was sent to Worcester, Massachusetts, to Isaiah Thomas, who was the printer from back at the beginning, who had published the Massachusetts Spy. When the war started, he moved from Boston to Worcester, and he stayed there the rest of his life. At the end of his life, he founded the American Antiquarian Society, which some of you may know. And that is one of the deepest collections of early American newspapers, because Isaiah Thomas, when he founded it, called or wrote, I guess, to all of his old buddies and said, send me all of your newspapers. And he kept all of his. This is his newspaper, his copy of the New Jersey Journal. And so he marked it along the side for his apprentices or journeymen to set this type. But he did something down at the bottom. It's hard to read in his handwriting, but it says, this account wants confirmation. And then it gets reprinted in the Worcester, Massachusetts Spy. That's the version on the right. And you can see at the end, there's a bracket with italics. This account wants confirmation. It's a very small thing, but Thomas has changed the nature of the news. The New Jersey Journal, Shepard Collick, the printer, published that story as straight news. It happened. Thomas has introduced doubt. I don't know why, because this is a very small instance. It's hard to show a smoking gun with these things. But it multiplied dozens of times each week over months and years. Printers can have a big impact with these kinds of changes. So all of these things are going on before the mid-1760s, when colonists began to protest imperial policies in force. And these protests were shaped in crucial ways by printers through business strategies. And in fact, one of the most important parts of the imperial crisis that leads to the revolution is often seen as the Stamp Act crisis. And I think we need to look at that through the printing trade. So by way of background, you're all back in history class. In March of 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which provided for taxes on all manner of printed goods. This is a printing of the Stamp Act listing just some of the items taxed. ranging from a half a penny tax to a tax of several pounds. It was comprehensive. It taxed newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, books, legal documents, commercial records, dice, playing cards, and more. Printers reacted. This is targeting the printing business. It's a tax on every single thing they sell. They reacted by doing what made most sense to them at first. They tried to make some money. So several immediately published pamphlet editions of the act and hawked them on the streets in their towns. Several included excerpts of the act in their newspapers or in their almanacs. And they made sure to use the act and its onset on November 1st, 1765, as advertising material. And the best place actually to see this is in the almanacs and in the sale of almanacs. Most people bought an almanac. These were small, they're not like the World Book Almanac where it's like that. It's a small, usually 24 or 32 page handheld document that would have a calendar and all sorts of other miscellaneous things in it. And so most people bought one. Usually you'd buy your almanac for the following year in November and December, and printers timed their workload that way. But with the Stamp Act taking effect on November 1st, many of them rushed them onto the market as early as August that year. And when they did so, they warned their customers. So here's an example from Providence of Sarah and William Goddard. They're a mother and son. And in this advertisement, the Goddards have gotten their almanac out, and they note, you can see circled, that they're unstamped. They warn their customers to get their copies early. After November 1st, the price goes up. So it's not just something to protest, it's also a marketing opportunity. Throughout the crisis, printers are shaping and refining the narrative through various editorial and business decisions just like this. And when riots occurred in various towns against the Stamp Act, they're choosing which account to reprint. So for example, New York printer John Holt, who was otherwise a reliable son of liberty, for some reason reprinted the loyalist governor of Massachusetts' proclamation about a Boston riot and didn't identify the source. He pulled that off of the off of his copy. And the Stamp Act riots dominated American news in the weekly newspapers. In just one issue of the Boston Evening Post in that September of 1765, the Fleet brothers printed a wide variety of Stamp Act-related news from all over the colonies. And collectively, these paragraphs from Virginia, from New Hampshire, things on Boston, from New York, from Maryland, dominated the newspaper. This is notable because it represents a shift. Before 1763, most of the news is from London. It's a hub and spoke model. Each colony is more interested in London than it is in other colonies. One of the things I love about the Stamp Act is that people also portrayed the paper and the stamp as having enormous power to harm colonists. So around November 1st, Sons of Liberty held mock funerals for their newspapers and for freedom of the press. So I'm going back to Bradford and the Pennsylvania Journal. On October 31st, this is not a Halloween decoration. This is a gravestone for his newspaper, which in the lower right corner, you can see the stamp. And the masthead is expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again. And this is a close-up of the emblem of the effects of the stamp. That's where the stamp is supposed to go. And then on the back, as if all that front page imagery didn't get to you, Bradford included this little epitaph, the last remains of the Pennsylvania Journal, which departed this life the 31st of October, 1765, of a stamp in her vitals, aged 23 years. Now, Boston reacted as only Boston could. You see, the act didn't take effect in 13 of the American colonies. It was nullified. Colonists from New Hampshire to Georgia forced the people charged with enforcing the act to resign their offices. So there was no one to sell the stamps, no one to enforce it. But Britain had 13 other colonies in Canada and in the West Indies. And in those colonies, the act did take effect. So there is stamped paper floating around the Atlantic, and those occasionally showed up in a North American port. One showed up in Boston in February of 1766. When it did, leaders arrested the paper and marched it through the streets of town. They then put the paper on trial for violating the rights of Bostonians as Englishmen and trampling on the principles of the British Constitution. According to the news reports, they convened a jury which deliberated for 2 hours. At this point, it's probably important to mention that they were in a tavern. After 2 hours, the jury found this piece of paper with a stamp on it guilty and pronounced the death penalty. So they marched the piece of paper through the streets again with effigies of George Grenville, who was essentially the prime minister. He had written the Stamp Act, and Lord Bute, who was the favorite minister of George III, and then burned the paper in a public ceremony. Now, that's all well and good, but what fun is it if you don't write about it in the newspaper? So here you can see in Barbados, the act taking effect. In the lower right corner, you can see the stamp. And then they print in the Boston Gazette this account of finding not that newspaper, because the piece of paper was burned. And what they do with this is they put an image in. It's very rare to see images in these colonial newspapers. Images are harder to make and they're expensive. What they tend to do is use what we today would call stock images. So they'll keep on hand a woodcut block of a ship, a horse, things like that that you can use over and over again. Somebody custom cut a piece of wood to do this, and it's Bute, who was Scottish, so he's on the left wearing a kilt, and Grenville, and the piece of paper. And what's holding the paper? The devil. Over ensuing years, and I'm skipping through a lot of things, printers continued to work to solidify the connections they were making among themselves with government and political organizations, and with these extra legal organizations like the Sons of Liberty and the Committees of Correspondence. So that, in skipping ahead, brings us back to 1773 and to the Tea Act, which brings us back to the Christmas box. Because I told you the story up until the moment it gets printed, but there's more. Because it became news they could use. This publication prevented a Philadelphia Tea Party. The networks did their job. As it happened, the Polly, which was the tea ship bringing tea to Philadelphia, appeared in Delaware Bay the very next day on Christmas. Because they knew what had happened in Boston, a group of Philadelphians went out to intercept the ship before it got within the radius where it had to report to the customs officials. They then get the ship captain to come into Philadelphia for a town meeting a few days after Christmas. They show him this publication and ever so politely suggest that he might want to turn around lest something bad happened to his newspaper. He agreed. The town cheered him and offered to provision his ship for an 8-week return journey across the Atlantic, now in the dead of winter. I feel a great deal of sympathy for the sailors who spent November and December and then also January and February sailing the Atlantic. This is the most compelling case, I hope, obviously. It's a great story, but it illustrates the importance of the work that printers did every day to make editorial decisions about what to publish and to make their connections. It mattered day to day and prepared them to act when these big moments came. That all changed when the Revolutionary War started a few years later in 1775. The war caused enormous difficulties for the printing trade. It made business far more difficult in a variety of ways. Most importantly, it caused tremendous dislocation for printers, literally disrupting networks because armies occupied many of the cities and towns where printers worked. So this map shows the number of printers from each town. If you can hear a noise in the background, my kids just got back. And they don't want to be quiet. You can see on this map, the number is the size of the circle, the bigger, the more escaped town, and then the political loyalties. Every town, as the Continental Army and the British Army moved through towns, and the British occupied almost every Atlantic port at some point during the war. And so when the British Army occupied, the Patriot printers left. When the Continental Army showed up, the Loyalist printers beat a path out of town. About half of printers active in 1775 had to relocate. And the economic deprivation was just profound. It was harder to get supplies, especially paper. And it's actually kind of ironic. Once the war started, politics determined whether you were able to print, but almost all of the decision-making after that was really purely about economics and commercial interests and trying to stay afloat. The war was especially catastrophic for loyalists who hadn't developed nearly the same ties as other printers as a group. Their networks tended to be much more insular, much more closed in on themselves, and much more tied to ethnic links through immigration, in particular among Scottish immigrants. They also relied much more heavily on patronage from imperial officials, and for obvious reasons, that dried up after 1775. They also were more publicly noticed as loyalists because by 1774 or so, it became a lot more difficult to manage a neutral standpoint in the newspapers. To be neutral was assumed to be loyalist, and so publishing anything supportive of British administration meant that the Sons of Liberty would tag you as a loyalist regardless of what your actual inclinations. So once the war started, most loyalists stayed behind British lines, and after the war, they left the United States at a much greater rate than the broader population of loyalists. To give you a sense of what this looked like, I want to tell you a little bit about Margaret Draper. Margaret Draper was one of those Green family printers that goes back to the 1640s and the very first printers in New England. She married Richard Draper, who was a distant cousin and so also part of the Green family. He ran a printing office in Boston for about 20 years and published the Boston Newsletter in an explicitly pro-administration stance. He died in 1774, and she took over the printing office and ran it and published the newsletter until early 1776 when the British evacuated Boston. At that point, she left for Halifax with her daughter and then went on to England. Once in London, she spent the better part of a decade trying to get compensation from the British government for her and her husband's efforts on behalf of the Crown. Now, she was able to do that because Parliament established a commission to hear claims for losses suffered by American loyalists, which means we have an excellent, if probably embellished, record of their experience of the war. And these are fantastic files. The originals are at the British National Archives, but they're actually available if anyone has an Ancestry.com subscription, that you can look at these from your home. Draper's file is one of the largest for any of the Loyalist printers. It runs over 100 pages, but it's relatively typical in its form. She made a number of petitions noting that she and her husband were steadfast in their support of Britain, even in the face of threats and violence from the people of Boston. When she was forced to leave, she said it was because she had, quote, rendered herself more the object of the rancor and malice of the people of the rebels, than most others. So she was clearly well connected among the loyalists. She had letters of support, letters of recommendation in her file from Peter Oliver, who was the colonial chief justice, and from General Thomas Gage, who was the military governor of Massachusetts. He's the one who ordered the march on Lexington and Concord, if the name is just enough familiar. For her efforts, she secured a living stipend of £60 per year, which is not a whole lot, a fraction of what she claimed as more than £500 per year that the printing office generated and recompense for property. And this document, just to show you an example, is a schedule of the property and income that she claimed, including revenue for the office. The Drapers owned an enslaved person, which is, I forget exactly where on this list that person is listed. And so they're making these claims. They're embellished, I'm sure, but they actually give us some pretty good numbers for how the printing business is working. With the war ending, Americans began to piece together the nation, and printers played a major role in that. The trade exploded after the war. In 1782, right around the end of the war, there were 113 active printers, and that almost doubled by 1789. The number of newspapers more than doubled from 45 at the end of the war, which stayed pretty much flat during the war, to over 100 in 1789 by the time Washington takes the oath of office as president. It wasn't an even development, though. There's two different things that are going on. First, the trade explodes as people start to head west, especially away from the Atlantic coast and across the Appalachian Mountains. In these areas, printing actually looked more colonial. It looked like what I described at the beginning of the talk, a single office in each town, sometimes not actually able to be supported by that town's business. And so they kept doing the same things, seeking government patronage, side businesses to stay afloat. In the big cities, in Boston, in New York, and Philadelphia, though, the trade was becoming much more specialized and with fierce competition. This is the period when the first daily newspapers are published. This is a period when they start to publish specialized commercial papers, printing news explicitly for a mercantile audience, modeled on something like Lloyd's List of London. And the growth in both areas was fueled by immigration. It's a moment when lots of printers are showing up, especially from England and Ireland. Now, a few of the loyalists stayed, some to loud protests from Americans, including James Rivington and Hugh Gain in New York City, and a few returned from exile out of economic necessity. In Savannah, for example, the state government of Georgia during the war confiscated the property of James Johnston, the Savannah printer, for being a loyalist and drove him out of the state, and he went off to the Bahamas. But when the war ended, they actually asked him to come back, and he did. He was eager to, because no one else would print in Savannah, Georgia, and he wanted his property back. So all of these printers, whether they're new, whether they're in growing cities, whether they're out further west, are using the same methods to build their businesses, making connections through kinship, through trade networks, through government positions. And one example to share with you is a man named Matthew Carey, who actually only spells his name with one T. He's a copy editor's nightmare. He was born and raised in Ireland as a Catholic, which made him part of that island's oppressed majority. Against his father's wishes, he trained as a printer in Dublin, and then became in political activism against the British. Sound familiar? That got him run out of Ireland to France for a year, where he actually tried to get work with Benjamin Franklin, who was in France as the American ambassador. He wasn't successful. Franklin suspected him of something amiss. And then once he went back to Dublin, officials jailed him for publishing an incendiary pamphlet. He was on release before his trial and boarded a ship for Philadelphia to escape. And he picked it because he had said he had seen coverage of his plight in Philadelphia's newspapers, and so thought he would get a sympathetic hearing. On the voyage, some of this is just dumb luck, Carey stumbled into unbelievable serendipity. On the same ship was none other than the Marquis de Lafayette, returning to America for a visit. Moved by Carey's experience, Lafayette wrote him a check for $400 towards opening a printing office. This doesn't happen to everybody. And he did him an even bigger favor. He got him an in with the most popular and famous American of them all, George Washington. Once he was in Philadelphia, Carey used the money to buy a press and start a newspaper. He called it the Pennsylvania Evening Herald, and then kept building his network. He tried to curry in favor with Washington successfully. He got an endorsement. Franklin did not like him, and so he never actually met success with Franklin. He also got swept up, once he arrived, in the movement to create an American national culture, along with people like Noah Webster of the dictionary and others. So he started, Carey did, in 1787, a magazine called the American Museum, which was monthly and intended to showcase American literature and science. It lasted 5 years, which sounds short to us, and it is, but it was also longer than any other magazine, or almost any other magazine in the 18th century. So he used the magazine to promote American culture, to promote American science, to promote American learning, and he tried to sell the magazine on the same scale. He engaged his printing friends as agents to sell copies of the magazine across the United States. Now, Carey's story, by the 1790s, he moves into book publishing. He gets hooked up with a Virginia minister, traveling minister named Mason Locke Weems. We know him better as Parson Weems, and publishes a biography of George Washington that you may have heard about. If you hadn't, I know you wouldn't lie to me about it. So that's Carey's interest. And here, as an example from the American Museum, is George Washington's endorsement. This is worth gold, to have and to be able to show other people that George Washington is endorsing your magazine. Like Carey, though, the younger generation that entered the trade after the war took far bolder stances than the printers who had experienced the imperial crisis 20 years earlier. Benjamin Franklin, at this point well into his 80s, and home to Philadelphia for the last time, was appalled. He wrote that printers and here I'm quoting, make no scruple of gratifying the malice of individuals by false accusations of the fairest characters among ourselves, augmenting animosity even to the producing of duels, and are moreover so indiscreet as to print scurrilous reflections on the government of neighboring states and even on the conduct of our best national allies, which may be attended with the most pernicious consequences. In other words, so much for free and open press. Younger printers, though, including his grandson actually, paid him little heed as they built their networks and expressed their opinions through their publications. By the time the Constitution was signed, printers had positioned themselves as strongly in favor of national networks. They strongly supported the Constitution. They took the lead in such event as there were a number of parades to celebrate ratification. They were called grand processions. And the printers marched together in towns like Philadelphia with floats with a printing press on a wagon to demonstrate how important they were. So fresh off their influential role in the imperial crisis and revolution, printers established themselves as key nodes in the information networks of the new republic. Congress concurred, at least insofar as they established the post office on a basis that facilitated and subsidized the circulation of news over private correspondence in the 1790s. So other scholars, my research work ends and other scholars pick up the story, printers used those networks in the 1790s to become key players in America's earliest political parties. And when they did that, they did so through the exact same business networks and political networks that they'd been building since 1763. Thank you. I appreciate you all listening. I can't see the list of participants, so I hope people are still here. We're going to do some questions. I'm going to stop sharing, but if anyone later wants to send me questions, you have my email address. And if you want to look for me on Twitter, you can come find me there as well. So Kathleen asks whether my research touches on how the press fomented the revolution itself. Indeed, it does. The short version, every once in a while, there's a theme of people tweeting their research, so it has to be very short. So when that comes around and I do it, it's printers won the American Revolution, which is obviously not entirely true, but yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to say with all of this work is that printers are actually a driving force for protests and for making them, right, they're not necessarily starting a particular protest, they're not necessarily writing something, but they're then circulating it. They're picking which accounts of riots, which stories, which newspaper essays become popular. So something like the Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer is something that a lot of people have heard of, that you maybe read something about in high school or college. That gets reprinted in almost every newspaper in the colonies in 1767 and 68, but each printer is making that choice, and they're not reprinting other things by their choice. And so they're who can make the arguments become popular because they have this power of the press that they can circulate things. So yeah, that's a really important point to bring up, Kathleen. Fran asks, where did plagiarism come into play? Discouraging wholesale copying of stories without attribution. Oh God, the long F. So plagiarism. In newspapers, it didn't exist as a concept in the 18th century. And in fact, it's actually the reverse. I didn't frame it this way, but the point was to copy things in many cases. So what you would do is, as with that example of the naval battle in the West Indies, you would go into somebody else's newspapers, you'd look for paragraphs that looked interesting, and then you'd reset the type and put them in your own newspaper. Now, usually when they did that, I'm not going to reopen the screen, it'll take me a while. But in the other newspaper, in the second newspaper, you list the place. Sometimes they list the newspaper. It depends on a whole range of things. But you list a sort of your source. But a lot of the point of the newspapers, and this is true with reprinting letters, you didn't usually identify the parties who had written back and forth to one another. There was a sort of smoothing out of authority, that it's the newspaper presenting this sort of not objective, but sort of voice from above, rather than so there's no bylines, there's nothing like that in the newspapers. And even the letters, it just says extract of a letter from Philadelphia or extract of a letter from Bristol or whatever. So yeah, and my students always find that fun because they get talked to a lot about plagiarism. And then we talk about 18th century newspapers, and the whole point is to plagiarize. So Tara asks about why the S in a ligature appears as an F in the Christmas box title. Okay, I'm going to reshare my screen because there's no way to do this without showing you. The short version, goodness. Try that again. Okay, so you can see Christmas box is spelled with, it's what's called a long S. In the handwriting that was taught in the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a long S in script that looks like a cursive F, but it's an S. And so in print, they created a letter. It's called the medial S. And so it was used at the middle and sometimes in the middle of words, never usually at the end. And it was something that was common practice until about 1800, and then it stopped. So it was widely used. They understood it. It causes havoc for digitized newspapers, for online databases, because the online databases don't know whether that's an F or an S, which makes looking at things an interesting process. But yeah, that's the short version. It is an S. It was from the cursive that was taught, that was converted into print, and then later, by about 1800, they stopped using that altogether, and it's just regular S's. And in terms of reading the newspapers, it's just something you have to just recognize the word, or just sit and look a little odd in the library, going at trying to pronounce the different words. So I think Richard's the next question. Yes, Richard's a bit confused because it sounds like the colonies were successful in ignoring the Stamp Act, which other British colonies paid. Was this an outcome of the Boston Tea Party, or did their success predate this event? And it predated it. The Stamp Act is in 1765, and the Tea Party is not till 73. So if the latter, which is the case, why the need for the Tea Party at all, since they had essentially succeeded in ignoring the law? You can do this in 30 seconds or 4.5 hours. The basic point is that at the end of the Stamp Act crisis, it ends with Parliament repealing the Stamp Act. They essentially say, we recognize that you're not going to pay this tax, so fine, we'll repeal it. At the same time, they pass something called the Declaratory Act, which says that Parliament has the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And those 4 words are important because they'll show up again in another document in 1776 that Thomas Jefferson and Congress wrote. One of their complaints is that Parliament claimed the power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So after 1766, they pass another law in 1767, or a set of laws called the Townshend duties, which are taxes on commercial goods, paint, glass, tea, lead, paper, all sorts of other consumer goods. And there is another set of protests against those for a number of years. And then most of those are repealed, again, because the British aren't getting very much money out of it, and it's causing them headaches, in 1770, and they leave the tax on tea. And then there's a 4-hour version of the story of the Tea Party. The Tea Party is a reaction against the Tea Act, which was in the summer of 1773. It actually, counterintuitively, lowered the tax on tea. What really bothered them, the American colonists who protested, was that it gave the British East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies, which they thought was a problem, partly because they didn't like being told what to do, and partly because they found British East India Company tea to be, this is being recorded, of lesser quality. they much preferred their smuggled Dutch tea, and smuggling had been sort of winked at and just allowed. And so the Tea Act, in giving a monopoly to the British East India Company, increased smuggling enforcement, which bothered many merchants who had engaged in the smuggling trade, like John Hancock, and was basically forcing them to pay a tax, even though it was lower, by forcing them to buy this tea that they didn't like. And that's what, in a longer version of the story, ends up with the Boston Tea Party. Very odd to have no breaks between questions. Okay, Allison asks, if there's a historical difference in the term correspondent as opposed to journalist. They seem to be used interchangeably now, but I'm wondering if that was always so. Gosh, that's a good question. So neither of those terms is used in this period. They don't come into play until the middle of the 19th century. My sense is, yes, they are used somewhat interchangeably now. My sense is that the term correspondent was used much more literally in its origins, that it would be, if you're a New York paper, you have a correspondent in London or Chicago or Baltimore or wherever. And so it was someone who was reporting at a distance, right? Not in the locality where the newspaper is published. So where a journalist would be, right, someone who practices journalism. And that's actually a term that comes out of the 1880s and 1890s, and a process that happens across a whole bunch of fields of what's called professionalization, that they're turned into professional, they become professions rather than simply trades. That era right around the turn of the 20th century is like when Columbia Journalism School is founded. And so, right, there's an academic pursuit of journalism as a study. That I hope that answers your question, Allison, in terms of what the differences might be. Part of the problem is that there's not a clear cut. Well, in 1867 they didn't use it. There's not a clear cut answer like that, so it's a little bit mushy. I'm happy to answer a couple more questions if anyone has them. Before everyone starts logging out, I want to thank everyone for logging in and hanging out with us this evening from wherever you are. I've very much appreciated it. As I said, I'm happy to answer questions for anybody afterwards if you'd like to send me an email or tweet or contact me otherwise. And if there's no more questions, I will hand it back to Nancy for anything you need to do to close up.